A man was beating on the door with all his might, asking for someone to open it. Seeing that no one answered, he concluded that no one was home. The protagonist was infuriated, thinking it was already the third month. She frowned a brow and wondered to herself what lunatic was coming to see her this time. A good example of the absurdity was the world of this novel and the protagonist herself, that she had reincarnated into it. However, to everyone's surprise, she wasn't bothered by this situation at all. The reason was that Sirings adapted to the new world very quickly. But the protagonist's life was not as simple as she would have liked. Her neighbor Andrew asked her if she had really gone on a business trip again. And Sirings told him yes. When asked how many people had come already, the girl replied, annoyed, that it was the sixth. The incident happened 2 years ago when someone collapsed in front of the protagonist's house. And she simply gave him first aid. After that, rumors started, and more sick people gathered in front of Searing's house. Luckily, since she isolated herself, the number of people coming decreased a lot. Searings was a jeweler by profession, so all that greatly complicated her business. The protagonist was an illegal jeweler who earned quite well in the poor neighborhood of Crixus. Andrew, the neighbor, asked her why she didn't change professions and become a healer, since she could earn more money that way. But Sirings answered, irritated, that a license was required for that and that she would be executed if caught. All people with special powers had to register at the temple, but first they had to obtain a license. If someone broke that rule, the temple took care of the punishment, specifically the temple's dog. Marquis Forsetti. The most common torture was cutting off 1 or 2 limbs, and some were even beheaded afterward. Searings said there was no way she would do that, because she already had her own job. Neighbor Andrew shrugged, and the protagonist reminded herself that she already had things to do. But the neighbor suggested that the man in front of the house clearly needed her help at that moment. The protagonist understood it was up to her to take care of him, and Andrew shouted loudly that she was a genius. Then he ran off immediately, saying he almost forgot his own work. Of course, the man heard everything and approached the protagonist, while she inwardly cursed Andrew. The stranger greeted the girl and asked if she was the owner of the house. He introduced himself as No Name because he didn't want to give his real name. The protagonist paused to think because she didn't understand why he used a nickname. No Name told her that he would then leave his trusted man with her. If someone heard that, they might think Seedings was offering other kinds of services. The protagonist was shocked when the man started to leave, telling her he trusted her. The girl was annoyed because she didn't understand why she had to look after someone as if he were a patient. But she had no other choice. So she slowly approached the injured man. Searings crouched beside him and muttered how she would manage to carry someone so big. The protagonist was frustrated because even neighbor Andrew had run off. She noticed that the man on the ground was seriously injured and wondered what had happened to him. Syrinx was surprised to see how handsome the injured man was. From the color of his hair, the protagonist immediately realized he was Heimdall Vespergo. He was one of the main characters of the novel and the antagonist, from a family famous for its power, but who suddenly lost everything. Suddenly, the protagonist noticed that the injured man's lips began to move. She moved a little closer and paid attention to understand what Heimdall Vespergo was saying. But suddenly, the young woman felt the man's hand touch hers. Searings immediately pulled away and pressed Heimdall Vespergo's leg with hers. The man stared at her as she indignantly asked him what he thought he was doing. A slight smile appeared on Heimdall Vespergo's face, leaving the protagonist completely surprised. This novel was quite unusual because in the first and second parts, the protagonists were different. And the genre also changed. The first part tells the story of the protagonist and her harem, but then, suddenly, the girl gets into trouble and dies. In the second part, the protagonist is the cousin of the previous one, who missed her sister very much. But later, the novel became for adults only, and Heimdall was the only one who didn't have a partner in the second part. On the contrary, he openly hated Frey and said that the girl's death was the meaning of his life. In reality, that hatred between them came from generations ago. The protagonist's parents kidnapped Heimdall's brothers to take revenge for what they did to their ancestors. In the end, everything culminated in one of the brothers being brutally murdered in front of the other. After that, they sold Heimdall on the slave market, where someone eventually bought him. In his childhood, the novel's protagonist witnessed a lot of cruelty and injustice. The boy was so broken that in the end, he grew up and became the personification of revenge. Heimdall's main target for revenge, of course, was the novel's protagonist, who was named Freya. This strong and extremely intelligent man tortured the protagonist mercilessly. That's why he was the antagonist. And right now, in front of Syrinx, was that great antagonist smiling. She didn't understand that expression on his face, the one that usually appears just before someone kills another. According to the novel, it was best not to cross paths with that man, so Syrinx truly didn't understand why he had come to see her. The protagonist angrily shouted at Mr. No Name, assuring him that she perfectly remembered his name. Perhaps the person who left Heimdall here is his mentor. It could also be one of the 5 feudal lords who control this area. But both men were a problem, because they have contact with very dangerous people. The protagonist sighed exhaustedly, because Heimdall's appearance only confused her more. Syrinx stood up and decided she was going to leave that antagonist there. She threw a warm blanket over him, but she was clear that it was better not to cross paths with that man at night. The girl informed the handsome man that in the morning she would decide what to do with him. But the next morning, the protagonist was furious, and the neighbor, Andrew, was massaging his tired shoulder. It was the first time in her life she had seen someone bigger and heavier than the local merchant. Syrinx sat right in front of the injured man and pulled her hair back into a ponytail. The protagonist looked at him closely and concluded that he was still alive. The neighbor asked if the people she had saved before weren't influential. Syrinx could have closed her shop and chosen one of them to marry. But the protagonist replied that she had only dealt with the assassin boss, a thief and an aristocrat who kidnapped people. They were all women, and to top it off, they only liked handsome men. The protagonist asked her neighbor not to say anything about them, because otherwise, they wouldn't last long. Even so, Andrew commented that the girl finally had her first male patient. Syrinx forced a smile and asked the neighbor what was wrong with his voice and face. Andrew went outside and, just in case, warned the girl to be careful near the man. There was an unwritten rule between them. They should not intervene, even if they cared about someone. The reason was that they never knew who might kill them and when. The protagonist understood that, to heal the antagonist, she first had to remove his clothes. But Syrinx knew very well that he could have a knife hidden somewhere and use it to attack her. The protagonist jumped when Heimdall made a soft sound. The man sat up, put on his glasses, and asked the protagonist who she was. Syrinx decided to act kindly, so she explained that she had fainted yesterday. And she saved him. The protagonist was shocked and tensed up as the man grabbed her roughly by the shoulders. But Heimdall only asked, confused, if she hadn't done anything strange to the young girl. She replied that she was also tired yesterday, that she decided to leave the man near the house, and apologized for not being able to carry him inside alone. As soon as she said her leg hurt, Heimdall pulled away abruptly and started apologizing. The man clenched his fists and told the girl that he still didn't feel well. Heimdall tried to explain to his savior that he became very strange at night. The protagonist apologized to the guest and asked if she should treat him. She explained that she gave him first aid, but that she couldn't leave the wound like that, as it could get infected. Syrinx told him he had to undress so she could heal him. Heimdall blushed immediately, but still listened to everything the protagonist said, and complied with what she asked. Furthermore, he had a good character and the appearance of a typical protagonist. But the readers gave him a nickname, because during the day he behaved like an innocent lamb, and at night like a ruthless wolf. In other words, Heimdall really had a split personality. The reason why Syrinx tried to stay away from Heimdall was his dark side, which always woke up at night. He changed so much that even the color of his eyes became different. The protagonist asked him if she could check him, and began to examine the wound closely. In reality, Heimdall had a very attractive body, and Syrinx wanted to touch him. The man, somewhat embarrassed, asked if she wasn't too close. The protagonist smiled and told him that this was normal between a doctor and his patient. Heimdall apologized immediately and explained that for a moment he had inappropriate thoughts. He had eyes blue as precious stones, in which an unknown sea could be seen. That was the image of a shy and reserved man, just as the novel described him. That innocent beauty attracted people, but at night another personality awoke. And all innocence disappeared. Seedings apologized to him and told him she wanted to ask him for something. He looked at her surprised, and she told him she wanted to touch him. Heimdall's face instantly turned red, and embarrassed, he asked what she was saying. The protagonist explained that she could only heal people through contact. That's why she was warning him. The man blushed even more and asked forgiveness for his reaction. He wasn't used to dealing with women, so he kept making mistakes. Syrinx discreetly took the crystal and told him it wasn't a big deal. The protagonist warned Heimdall that he would have to endure a little. He got scared, and Syrinx, smiling, asked the patient not to cry. During the conversation, the protagonist noticed that the man had a very tearful character. Heimdall blushed again and asked the girl not to make fun of him. The protagonist placed her hands over the antagonist's wound and used her crystal. The man was surprised as soon as he saw that his wound was closing quickly. Then Heimdall realized, amazed, that his wound had completely healed. He asked if the girl was really a healer, and Syrinx replied that she did it illegally. The wounds were deep, and the protagonist spent too much mana healing them. But she asked the man not to tell anyone because she didn't want to die suffering. Syrinx reminded him that the temple also punishes those who break the rules by cutting off their tongues. Heimdall replied that he knew their harsh punishments, but that he didn't plan to tell anything about what happened. The protagonist warned him under no circumstances to tell Marquis Forsetti anything. Then the young woman stood up and offered the blonde to check his back. In this world, the ability to heal others was considered a real and very valuable gift. The Altar of Discipline was a group of priests who fought against those who broke the rules. Marquis Forsetti's family led the most powerful temple in this world. The head of the family was a paladin named Euban Forsetti, known in the Empire as a hero. He was obsessed with the first part's protagonist and then with Freya, who had healing powers. In other words, the power to heal awakened men's interest. However, Syrinx wasn't very enthusiastic about that power, because she could only heal using the magic of precious stones. The girl's method was very strange, so if she were caught, the temple would give her a very harsh punishment. The good thing was that she was in a place where it would be difficult for them to find Syrinx. As long as no one came for the protagonist, she could continue doing her thing. But Syrinx perfectly understood that it was better not to get too involved in those matters. She asked the man if anything else was bothering him, and he replied that he was fine now. The protagonist opened the door wide and told the young man he could leave now. The blonde immediately got nervous and hastily replied that he had to thank his savior. Syrinx started pushing him toward the exit, telling him it wasn't necessary. Heimdall wanted to thank the girl, but she told him he could do it from the other side of the door. Then the protagonist kicked the man out and said goodbye to him, and then locked herself in. She leaned against the door and felt quite good. Syrinx was sure that everything was finally over, but the young woman's happiness didn't last long. A few days later, the protagonist met Heimdall again. And the important thing was that all this happened in the middle of the night. That day, the protagonist was returning home after a really tough mission. She was furious because those damn nobles wouldn't obey her. The young woman slowed her pace as the person in front of her called her by name. Syrinx raised an eyebrow when he said he had been waiting for her for a long time. The vagrant was sure that this beauty had earned some money recently. That guy, who looked a lot like a catfish, was called Torch. The head of the assassin guild tried to trick Syrinx, but failed, and now the guy wants revenge for it. Torch didn't like that the girl stayed silent, so he asked her, annoyed, if she was listening to him. He asked how she could put such a brazen face in front of a man, because he found it disgusting. The protagonist frowned and asked what nonsense he was talking about now. Syrinx no longer wanted to leave her house, so she asked him if he wasn't tired of coming to bother her. Torch moved closer to the girl and told her not to count on her bodyguard, because he wasn't around today. The protagonist knew perfectly well that the knight wasn't patrolling the neighborhood today, but was drinking in a bar instead. But she just laughed and said she wasn't even thinking of depending on the bodyguard. Syrinx just thought the head of the assassin guild was a brainless idiot. The guy's face twisted with rage when the girl told him he was nothing more than a nobody. He shouted that bitches like her only obey when you show them that pretty little face. The protagonist approached him and, laughing, pointed out how short the head of the assassin guild was. Torch started to get furious when Syrinx said that surely his brain was also tiny. The young woman tensed up as the hand of the head of the assassin guild lunged towards her. But suddenly Torch grimaced in pain and grabbed his arm. A familiar voice, right next to the protagonist's ear, asked what was going on there at this hour. Syrinx looked at Heimdall with annoyance and thought what the hell he was doing there. The head of the assassin guild lunged to attack the antagonist, but he dodged the blow without problems. Heimdall tripped him, and Torch fell flat on his face onto the stone path. Then the blonde threw a dagger between his fingers and told him coldly that he didn't need to know who he was. Then the blonde smiled mischievously and greeted the beautiful girl. He took off his glasses and thought that she knew him and perfectly knew why he had come to that alley. Heimdall promised her that if she told him the whole truth, he wouldn't kill her. The protagonist looked down as soon as she realized she was in danger. Instead of those innocent blue eyes, now red and unfamiliar eyes were looking at her. Syrinx looked coldly at the man and understood that she was in deep trouble. The antagonist told Frey that even if she gave him everything, the only thing he would want would be her throat cut. This was the knight Heimdall, the one who only does crazy things. At that moment, the man looked at the protagonist with a slight smile on his face. He asked her why she was quiet if he had already asked her a question. Syrinx squeezed the precious stone in her pocket, and Heimdall warned her not to even think about lying to him. It seemed strange to the blonde, because he was sure the girl knew him. The protagonist tensed up as Heimdall pulled out a knife and asked her why she couldn't remember him. The protagonist was shocked when the man suddenly turned and blocked the attack. Torch angrily asked the antagonist if he really thought he was going to let himself be humiliated. Syrinx froze when the head of the assassin guild called her a witch. The man kept shouting that he would never forgive that girl for that. The protagonist pointed at the blonde and said that he was the one who hit, that she had nothing to do with it. But Torch was convinced that it was Syrinx who cast a spell on the man and forced him to hit. The girl frowned and, annoyed, asked how he came up with such an idea. The head of the assassin guild kept shouting that Syrinx would still pay dearly for daring to mess with him. But the girl spread her arms and calmly replied that she hadn't done anything to him. Syrinx said that even if Torch asked her to, she wouldn't touch him. With a mocking smile, Syrinx added that she wouldn't do it because he is ugly. The guild master became indignant, while Heimdall just smiled seeing how the girl behaved. The protagonist added that she is a lover of beauty and only likes handsome men. So she would never choose Torch. These words clearly hurt the man, and he started shouting at the girl to shut up finally. Syrinx asked Torch if he even knew what people said about him. She said that everyone around here thinks the head of the assassin guild is ugly inside. And outside, a subordinate grabbed his boss and reminded him that it was time to leave, because it would soon dawn. The protagonist waved her hand and told them to get lost, while they could still walk on their own. Torch froze as soon as the girl asked if they wanted a good beating. The head of the assassin guild promised he would smash Sitting's pretty face and send her to be sold in the 5th district. But the protagonist just wished him enough life to try. As soon as the assassins left, Heimdall, smiling amusedly, commented that the girl is quite cold. Looking around, the protagonist realized that there was no one else, and that they were alone in the street. Heimdall pointed his dagger at her and asked what relationship she had with that guy. Seedings replied that the first time they met, he tried to rob her. The blonde concluded that the idiot clearly didn't succeed, and the girl agreed with him. The protagonist was very clear that Heimdall could kill her at any moment. The man smiled mischievously and ordered that, from that moment on, the girl should answer the same way. The young woman took a step back and asked what he meant by that. But he just leaned closer to her ear and, whispering, asked why she always avoided answering. And didn't want to tell anything. A nervous smile appeared on the protagonist's face, and she asked what it was that. According to him, she didn't want to tell. Heimdall wanted to know where the young woman knew him from. He lived on the run and saw very few people, so he didn't understand how a girl like that could know him. The man suggested they go inside the house because they had a lot to talk about. They did so, and Heimdall immediately asked if she was the one who saved him that night. The protagonist replied yes, although she knew perfectly well she was getting into something she shouldn't. Normally, everyone treated the protagonist indifferently because of her appearance. And Heimdall was a very detail-oriented guy. With a smile, the man recounted that he couldn't stop thinking about how he had recovered so quickly after the attack. The protagonist, somewhat confused, replied that this is normally called help, not blame. It also surprised her how he managed to survive all that. With a big smile, Syring suggested the man let her go, since she had already told him everything. Heimdall smiled sideways and thought it wasn't easy to fluster her, because even in that situation, she remained calm. The protagonist replied that, to live here, that was normal and that many were already used to it. Furthermore, Searings knew the man's problematic personality well, so nothing surprised her. He smiled slightly when the young woman told him her hands hurt. The protagonist showed him her tied hands and asked him to untie her. But the blonde only commented that she spoke very calmly. In a cold voice, Heimdall asked if it was really because she was so sure she wouldn't die today. The man recounted that he woke up a few days ago and found an address on his table that he didn't know. Being very curious, he decided to go see what it was about. Searings concluded that this guy was smart, regardless of whether it was daytime or nighttime. Heimdall's personalities did not remember each other's memories. The night Heimdall was, in fact, obsessed with finding out what happened while he slept. And that was a serious problem for the protagonist. Surely, the daytime Heimdall wanted to meet the girl, but couldn't because she had left. The man rolled up his sleeve and deduced that the girl was an illegal healer. Searings was shocked and began to demand that he stop immediately. The blonde suddenly slit his veins with a knife and, with a sarcastic smile, asked if she could heal him. The protagonist smiled sideways and thought that the night Heimdall was completely crazy. It was clear that he wanted Searings to prove what she said, and the girl didn't understand why. She looked at her tied hands and resignedly accepted it in silence. Raising an eyebrow, she warned the lunatic that her powers were not cheap. Heimdall asked her why she helped someone like him then. The protagonist replied that it was because he behaved in a completely different way. The blonde smiled and supposed that the girl had run into his daytime version. Although Syrinx healed people, she didn't like seeing blood at all. The protagonist approached the man and used her healing powers. Heimdall looked at his hand in astonishment as soon as he realized that the girl had truly healed it. She silently suggested to the blonde that he should let go and go home. The man approached the girl and apologized if he had scared her. It seemed curious to him, because she was the first person who sat calmly in front of someone so threatening. But the protagonist only replied that everything happens for the first time. Heimdall explained that the others simply died before being able to say anything. The man looked at the girl closely and asked her what she thought of all this. A slight smile appeared on the protagonist's face, and she said she didn't even know how to answer. Searings was sure that if the blonde had wanted to kill her, he would have already done it. He didn't seem like the type to hesitate much before killing someone. Heimdall was surprised as soon as the girl pointed out that he clearly enjoyed taking his opponents by surprise. The protagonist managed to free her hands from the tight ropes by herself. Then she used her magic powers, and while doing so, asked the man if she was right in her conclusion. A shockwave quickly threw Heimdall against the wall. Veins showed on his cheeks. His gaze turned cold, and he pulled another knife from his pocket. However, the protagonist cast another spell, and the man felt that he couldn't move. Syrinx grabbed her sword and told the blonde that things had changed now. She took the knife from him and asked if he was surprised. The protagonist smiled mischievously and said she wasn't going to apologize. The young woman told him that he had been too confident because it wasn't that easy with her. Rage was visible in Heimdall's eyes, and he coldly asked what she had just done to him. Sittings recounted that she knows some spells that can protect her. She couldn't use them on others because they only worked on the opposite sex. The protagonist was very annoyed that Heimdall was a man. With a smile, the girl told him she hoped the blonde wasn't upset about having his hands tied. The man, annoyed, wanted to know what that girl planned to do with him now. The protagonist paused to think, and then replied that some animals damage the ecosystem. The man smiled forcedly, but Syrinx told him she would let him go free. However, she planned to do so only when it dawned. Heimdall smiled sideways and asked what would happen next. If he came back, the young woman would be in serious danger. Syrinx replied that, in that case, she would make her spell last for about a month. She looked at the blonde's smile and thought that, in reality, nothing bothered her. Heimdall promised the girl that he would not forget this. The protagonist found it amusing because he was the one who started all that with her. But the young man only replied that, by nature, he is selfish. Therefore, the illegal healer only had to trust that magic would help her. The protagonist looked at the man's half-bare chest and smiled mischievously. Heimdall wanted to know how the spell she used sounded. She recited it and asked if that was the one he was talking about now. The young girl explained that, with that spell, she can make people sit down. The man let out a laugh and started following the girl with his eyes, curious. The protagonist wished the man a good night, calling him puppy. And then she left. The next morning, Heimdall said he would take full responsibility. The protagonist approached the man and tensed up as soon as he raised his head and looked at her. Heimdall narrowed his eyes and then was shocked when he realized who was in front of him. He started looking for his glasses desperately, but they were already in the protagonist's hands. The blonde looked closely at the girl when she put the glasses on his face. Syrinx stepped aside and informed the daytime Heimdall that everything was ready. The man, horrified, asked if he had done anything bad during the night. The protagonist paused to think and replied that she didn't even know what to say. He opened his mouth wide and asked what terrible thing he had done. Syrinx, with a mischievous smile, repeated that she didn't even know how to say it. And then the protagonist lied to the man, telling him that he had harassed her. Heimdall fell to his knees, exhausted, realizing he couldn't control himself. Syrinx was confused when she noticed that the blonde started crying. He looked handsome when he cried, and the protagonist didn't understand where that bandit had gone. While the man sobbed, she asked him what he was doing. The blonde promised the young woman that he would take responsibility. Syrinx fell silent as soon as the man promised he would take care of everything. She asked the blonde how he planned to do it. Heimdall blushed immediately and told the girl that he would marry her. But the protagonist immediately replied that it wasn't necessary to do that. The blonde reminded her that she herself had told him he harassed her. The protagonist burst out laughing and replied that she was only joking with him. Then Heimdall asked her to let him ask why she had tied him up. A sly smile appeared on Syrinx's face, and she told the man that he had threatened her. The blonde froze instantly and then clenched his lips in anger. In a more serious tone, he asked if he had hurt the girl. Syrinx replied that, thanks to her abilities, the man hadn't hurt her at all. The elderly, women, and children were the type of people who had to be very careful in that alley. However, they had their own reasons for living in that place, so they weren't going anywhere. Syrinx just wanted to explain that, in that area, everyone managed as best they could. But the young woman didn't understand what that look meant as she looked at the blonde. Suddenly, Heimdall started apologizing and asked the protagonist to help him this time. The protagonist immediately stepped aside and asked what he meant. He knew very well that he was an impudent person, but Syrinx could help him. The young woman waved her hand in front of the man's face and suggested that he calm down first. She told him that of course she would listen to the blonde, but that she didn't interfere in her patient's affairs. And much less did the protagonist plan to have anything to do with that man. Heimdall asked them to listen to him because this had to do with his other personality. The one that woke up at night. He had no idea how to explain all that to the girl. The blonde recounted that they didn't know each other's memories. Although the protagonist already knew all that perfectly, she was curious to hear it from someone else. What happened in the darkness of the night, Heimdall could not describe in any way. Moreover, the man had no control over it, so he couldn't stop it either. Syrinx concluded that perhaps it had to do with him being covered in blood that day. She asked the blonde if he knew the person who brought him to her that night. Heimdall nodded and supposed it was probably someone he trusted. He was about to say something else about that person. But the protagonist interrupted him. Better not to know that name than to find out more and then get into trouble. The protagonist told the man he didn't have to tell her anything if he didn't want to. Heimdall's ears turned red, and he asked if the girl really disliked him that much. Syrinx was surprised by the sudden question and asked what he was talking about. The man explained that he meant that the girl didn't want to get involved with him. The blonde felt a bit sad hearing it because he didn't think things were that bad with him. More encouraged, Heimdall exclaimed that he wasn't as bad as the young woman might think. The protagonist forced a smile because she didn't expect to hear confessions like that. Syrinx didn't think the blonde had blushed because of what he himself said. The protagonist became very curious to know what he was thinking about. Heimdall said he doesn't know why he ended up in this place and that he is truly sorry. Suddenly, the man asked what would happen if he saw the girl again and she could heal him. The blonde promised that he would repay the favor, whatever the cost. Suddenly, Syrinx touched the man's lips, silencing him. She asked the young man not to speak so lightly. The protagonist explained that one has to be very careful what is said in this alley. Heimdall blushed as soon as she asked what he would do if he were asked to do something unexpectedly special. The blonde's body tensed as the young man touched his bare chest with a finger. The girl thought what to ask him and suggested the man pay her with his body. Heimdall immediately pulled away and suggested that Syrinx ask him to do some physical work. He said he was good at that, although the protagonist didn't believe him at all. The truth is that there was a high probability that this handsome man would be sold as a slave in the 5th district. But the knight Heimdall wouldn't forgive him for it, and in a few years he would burn that market to the ground. The protagonist applauded and said she would do what the man asked. The blonde paused for a few seconds, thinking about what the healer had just told him. He was immediately glad when he realized everything the girl had told him. The protagonist nodded and informed him that she would continue to treat him. When the main character is on stage, supporting characters can go unnoticed. And that suits Syrinx well. Heimdall thanked the girl and confessed that he didn't think she would accept something like that. It seemed to him that the girl didn't really want to heal people, which is why he reached that conclusion. Over time, Heimdall will discover his healing ability on his own, but for now, Syrinx decided to help him. The fact that the protagonist heals the man a couple of times will not change the plot of the novel. She was sure that sooner or later, that man would forget everything good she had done for him. Then, after a great and terrible event, he will become the main antagonist of the story. The blonde kept thanking the young woman, and that was starting to annoy her. She told him he didn't need to thank her yet, because that help wasn't free. Syrinx asked him if he really thought she wouldn't ask for anything in return. But Heimdall was surprised and wanted to know what the healer wanted from him. A smile appeared on the protagonist's face, and she asked what he could offer her. The blonde paused to think and replied that he wasn't foolish, and that she knew it well from the first. And second part of the novel. Heimdall immediately, enthusiastically, shared that he knew how to cook and also had a lot of money. But Sitting's beauty didn't interest him, and he already had enough money. Cooking didn't appeal to him either, because he bought everything from the next-door house. The truth is, the protagonist found it hard to believe that this man was the main antagonist. However, the young woman perfectly understood that she shouldn't be fooled. Heimdall suddenly stood up and asked how about he helped her with the accounting. He pointed to the board and explained that he meant exactly that. The man said that amidst the calculations, there was a multiplication error. It was easier to solve those kinds of accounts vertically, not horizontally. The protagonist was surprised by the skills of this blue-eyed man. Heimdall explained that he has good eyesight, even if he wears glasses. In fact, the young girl really didn't understand how he calculated that so quickly. The man apologized and asked her if she followed market trends. He knew it from the calculation system and noticed some poorly organized things he could help with. Syrinx didn't even hesitate because she herself wasn't very good at that. In the end, it seemed that this man wanted to work as an accountant or secretary. The blonde promised that he would work hard and that she could trust him. The protagonist wanted to know what they were going to do with him at night. Heimdall, with a calm smile, told Syrinx that she could simply leave him unconscious. He, not making a big deal of it, suggested doing it with a frying pan. Better if it was with the edge. The protagonist agreed and told him that she would only heal him during the day. The man agreed and promised that he would try not to hurt her. Syrinx nodded, although she knew perfectly well that the daytime Heimdall had no control over that. As soon as night fell, the girl wondered how many more times she would see this scene. She sat in front of the man and asked if this time they really hadn't even brought him a puppy. Heimdall angrily told her that she had better stop talking to him in that sarcastic tone. The protagonist noticed that the man was covered in wounds. Deep down, the young woman began to wonder how that had happened. Heimdall smiled as soon as the girl told him that his daytime version had agreed to leave him unconscious. She added that he had even recommended using the edge of the frying pan to do it. The protagonist shared that they even chose which frying pan would be best to use. Heimdall smiled sideways and asked if he had really said that. But of course, the protagonist wasn't planning to do that to him. She asked the man if he understood what state he was in right now. Syrinx was surprised at how he was still conscious after such a beating. The blonde, with a crazy smile, asked if such things weren't better said after the fight. The protagonist froze as soon as the man asked if she had told him they had beaten him. She reached that conclusion because Heimdall looked like a stray dog, and it made sense. Anyone would think that seeing those wounds, but Heimdall disagreed. He said that usually people ask exactly where they were hurt. Furthermore, Heimdall didn't seem like someone who could be beaten that easily. During the day, he could only imagine what his other personality did at night. Then Heimdall coldly asked the girl what she knew about him. The protagonist cursed to herself because that guy had discovered her. She asked what kind of face the blonde had now, as if he were going to break her neck. Heimdall smiled because the girl didn't call him by his name. The protagonist asked him if he realized that she was the one who saved him last time. Thanks to her, Heimdall's life was much calmer now. Someone who survived thanks to Syrinx shouldn't talk to her like that. The protagonist was annoyed that the man looked at her as if he still owed her something. Syrinx was annoyed that the blonde hadn't even thanked her for saving him. The girl knew very well those types of people, capable of anything for their objective, even killing their own parents. She understood that, for someone like Heimdall, that was normal, but still he couldn't treat her with such hatred. The man writhed in pain and tried to say something, but the protagonist ordered him to be quiet. In any case, the blonde wasn't going to hurt her, because she could heal him. Syrinx moved away and smiling, asked him if he was already planning to kill her. In reality, the protagonist was only pretending, because she wanted to teach that man a lesson. At least, it was good to know that Heimdall didn't feel so bad. The young woman noticed that the man's hand needed urgent attention. So the protagonist took a rope from a wooden box and approached the blonde. The man frowned and asked the girl what she was doing. In an unconcerned tone, the protagonist replied that she was just tying him up. She told the foolish and grumpy gentleman that she knew how to tie up animals. Heimdall replied that if he wanted to die, he should keep going. Syrinx laughed instantly and started making funny but sweet faces at him. Making a puppy face, the girl asked him if he really still wanted to kill her. Heimdall's gaze turned even colder, but that no longer surprised the young woman. The protagonist warned him that if he tried to hit her with that huge fist, she would scream very loudly in fright. The girl reminded him that if she wanted to, she could drown him right now in the river because he wouldn't be able to get out. Heimdall smiled sideways and told her that in the end, it seemed he was even better than her. Syrinx asked him if this was like that day when she found him with the knife. The man moved a little closer to the beautiful girl and told her that her eyes showed she was afraid at that moment. The protagonist pulled away and replied that it was actually him who wanted her to be afraid of him. The blonde just smiled sideways and admitted that he had lost to her. He frowned as soon as she approached his hand and started healing it. Healing with gems was painful and took time. Syrinx promised to give him a candy if he endured the pain a little longer. Then, the protagonist's hands moved to the blonde's torso and continued with the healing. The young girl focused on the man's face, who was doing everything possible to endure the pain. She took some gems out of her pocket and asked him how he could treat his own body like that. Syrinx asked him to keep in mind that, at any moment, his body might not be able to withstand it anymore. Heimdall looked at the young woman and asked if she was speaking from her own experience. Little by little, the man's wounds began to close and were no longer a danger. The blonde was surprised when the girl asked him to lift his head. The protagonist explained that she was going to heal his neck because that was what hurt him the most. Syrinx didn't understand how he could endure so much pain and how long he had been suffering like that. Heimdall concluded that she must have a decent life and asked if there was really any reason to help him. She recounted that normally two types of people lived in those neighborhoods: victims and criminals suffering from guilt. The blonde approached the protagonist and commented that, apparently, she didn't seem to feel guilt. A slight smile appeared on the man's face, and he asked if that was compassion. Everything showed on the girl's face, so he asked her if something similar had happened to her, or if it happened to someone close to her. The protagonist replied seriously that she didn't have to answer those kinds of questions. Heimdall said he understood people's emotions very well, but the girl calmly replied that he had better analyze his emotions after the treatment. When she finished speaking, the protagonist turned around and told the man she was leaving. However, she knew perfectly well that she couldn't leave him like that, alone on the street. It was the end of winter. It was still cold outside, and the blonde's tiredness and exhaustion remained. The man lifted his head as soon as the girl called him and told him she was going to give him an option. Either he slept tied up on the street, or he promised her he wouldn't cause harm and she would let him into the house. Seeing the man's reaction, Syrinx wondered if she should really have said that. Making a gesture with her hand, the protagonist asked him to forget the topic. But the blonde's lips curved into a satisfied smile. He promised to comply and asked the pretty girl to state her conditions. But the girl replied that there were actually no conditions. Although the blonde clearly didn't believe it and stared at her intently, Syrinx put her wooden briefcase on the floor and said she was going to tell him something. She confessed to the blonde that, just like him, she had been through a lot in her life. She had two younger brothers, and one of them was injured because his father hit him and severely damaged his eyes. That's why, after that incident, the girl couldn't look at other people's injuries calmly. Syrinx showed a red precious stone and swore she was telling the truth. Heimdall lowered his head and asked why she had to do that. But she only asked the grouch to repeat that, from that moment on, he would be a good person. As soon as the man said he wouldn't do it, the protagonist was disappointed because it didn't work. Then the young woman raised a precious stone in front of her. She promised that tonight, whatever happened, she would not harm that man. When Heimdall also promised to keep his word, the protagonist invited him in. But the man asked what would happen if he broke his promise. She answered calmly that she would simply chain him up, but if he kept his word, there would be no problem. As soon as the man entered the house, Syrinx offered him a seat on the sofa. With an arrogant smile, he asked if she was really going upstairs and leaving him alone with such an attractive body. But the protagonist just frowned and asked him to stop talking nonsense and go rest for once. Heimdall did as the young woman asked and collapsed onto the soft sofa. He was slightly surprised to notice that the girl wasn't planning to come up, so he asked why. Searings reminded him that she had already told him she was a busy person and that money didn't just come by itself. The young man turned his head when he heard the front door open. At the door of the house stood a visitor in a black coat and hat. The protagonist exclaimed that her favorite client had arrived. She hadn't seen him in a long time, so she asked how she could help him. The man cleared his throat and replied that the girl still received guests with the same hospitality. Searings answered that her kindness and loyalty, just like her precious stones, never changed. Then, the visitor took a small pouch from his coat and handed it to the young woman. The protagonist noticed that the visitor was trembling a lot and didn't understand why. But she replied that he could pay her in gold, as he always did. The guest just nodded and asked the girl to do it as quickly as possible. He was a regular client who always brought good things, but today he was acting strange. Syrinx took the gold and handed it to her dear client. In a whisper, he told her that she shouldn't tell anyone, but that she should be careful. The protagonist looked at her guest surprised and asked what he meant. But the man in the hat didn't answer anything and simply turned around, ignoring the girl who asked him to wait. Syrinx thought that perhaps they had changed bosses in the neighboring organization and decided to find out tomorrow. She put on special glasses and sat right in front of Heimdall to examine the jewels. The blonde commented that the visitor was somewhat strange because he was drenched in cold sweat. The protagonist shared that normally he didn't behave like that, but today he was strange. Heimdall smiled and said that people always act like that when something terrible is near. Then the blonde asked the girl what was wrong with her face. Syrinx raised an eyebrow, and Heimdall explained that with clients she was completely different. The protagonist laughed and asked him if he also wanted her to behave like that with him. But Heimdall didn't answer anything. He just put his feet on the table and closed his eyes. The young woman began to examine all the precious stones the visitor had brought her. She had the feeling that a stray cat had snuck into her house. Although it wasn't even a cat, but a predator. Because the man looked more like a Bengal cat. He asked with annoyance what she was doing. And the girl replied that she was examining the precious stones. Heimdall explained that he was talking about the profession and asked her if she really wanted to manufacture her own product. Syrinx smiled and asked why he wanted to know that, and if he was now interested in her. The blonde's face immediately looked surprised, and he intently watched the young woman. Then Heimdall chuckled quietly and asked how she noticed. He wanted to know what she thought of him, because that beautiful face was worth a lot of money. The protagonist's cheeks instantly blushed, because she didn't expect that from the blonde. He tore a button from his sleeve, ran his hand over his abs, and asked the girl what she thought of his body. The young woman began to shake her head from side to side, telling herself mentally that she must control herself. Syrinx asked him not to distract her, because she had to finish the work before dawn. Heimdall, smiling, said he would be an excellent husband who kills people. The protagonist took a precious stone and noticed it was quite clean. She was very lucky because that could be sold for a fortune. Throughout that time, the blonde struggled not to fall asleep. The protagonist kept examining the precious stones and was very happy when she finally found what she was looking for. Thanks to her power, she could identify a valuable stone, as in her family that special ability was passed down since childhood. And because of that gift, Syrinx led a most interesting life. Noticing the question in the man's eyes, the girl explained that it wasn't that easy to find something valuable. She looked at the blonde surprised when he suddenly stood up and asked what was going on. The protagonist noticed that the man's gaze turned cold and that he stared intently at one spot. Heimdall clearly scared the protagonist, although she tried to pretend it wasn't so. The young woman went to look for another stone and suddenly stood completely still. The blonde pulled a dagger from his pocket and warned that the house would soon be surrounded. Now Syrinx understood why the client told her to be careful. Noticing the man's look, the protagonist asked him why he was looking at her like that. She showed him the necklace and told him it was a stolen item. Furthermore, everyone in the empire wanted that precious stone. Outside, they were surrounded by knights who, apparently, weren't planning to leave. All because they held something very valuable to an important family. That's why the knights came here. So the situation was not easy at all. The blonde concluded that the girl was as trapped as he was. The protagonist smiled and told him that he could also be caught along with her. Searings took the young man by the hand and suggested he follow her. He frowned and immediately asked where she would take him. The girl replied that if he wanted the knights to catch him, he could stay there. The blonde replied that leaving was a good idea, but he still needed to know where to go. The protagonist suggested they first go together through a secret door. She bent down and Heimdall asked if they were really going to escape. The young woman opened the secret door and replied that no. It turned out that the protagonist's secret door led to another house, which was great. Andrew's neighbor, seeing her, smiled at her and asked what had happened again. The young girl sighed tiredly and replied to her friend that everything was still the same as always. The man prepared everything necessary in a paper bag and handed it to her. Searings thanked the neighbor for his help and paid him with a coin. Andrew accepted it immediately and asked if she was leaving already. When she told him yes, he warned her that next time he would invite her. The neighbor was a bit serious, and Andrew, already worried, told her he truly hoped everything was all right. He wished her luck and confessed that he would be very sad if he were to lose such a good neighbor. Searings replied that if she were killed, it would surely be Torch's fault. The neighbor asked if that had anything to do with her having left recently. He explained that he was simply worried that his clients were disappearing one after another. If the protagonist wanted to leave the first district, she had to always walk around 8 o'clock sharp. And not deviate. The blonde asked her to stop and explain at least something. Syrinx didn't understand how he still had the strength to follow her, if after the treatment he should rest for at least 3 days. Heimdall smiled sideways and told her that he didn't mind escaping with such a girl at all. However, he didn't understand why they were doing it or what the reasons were. The blonde intertwined his fingers with hers and asked if he really had no right to know. The man squeezed her hand tighter and told her he wouldn't let go until she calmed his curiosity. The protagonist pressed her lower lip, realizing she had no other choice. Searings explained again to him that it was something stolen. However, Heimdall was sure that an illegal like her was already used to that. Searings agreed, but added that, unless it was all part of some plan. That the knights surrounded the house at night was not a coincidence. Such a rare stone ended up in the hands of an illegal, so it was definitely a trap. The protagonist handed the object to the man and explained that it was the tears of a slod. It is the best gem in the Empire, with 120 years of history. 8 years ago, the Emperor gave this jewel to his younger sister when she married Count Amenti. It became a family heirloom for Countess Amenti, so in the Empire there is no one who doesn't know that stone. Recently, Count Amenti announced that the heirloom had disappeared, and by his order. The search continued. The Count sent the knights to search for the jewel in the black market. That's why they have been hanging around this area the whole time. That guy acted very strangely, and Syrinx noticed that he was afraid of something. The blonde supposed that probably someone just wanted to blame her. The protagonist agreed and thought that it was the same people he had beaten last time. Heimdall thought about it and replied that he had already beaten many people. But Syrinx explained that it was that man who looked like a catfish. She was sure that his men could have planted the stolen object on him. The man concluded that this girl had caused a lot of trouble for that guy. Heimdall was not surprised to think that, in the market, even clients can betray. The protagonist looked closely at her interlocutor and asked why he hadn't left yet. He thought about it and replied that when they left the shop, one of the knights had seen him. Furthermore, the man was clear that in that state he wouldn't get far alone. Heimdall was also sure that this strange girl had some safe place. She was healing him, so she should take responsibility for her patient. Syrinx replied that she had never done anything for anyone after healing them, and that he was the most brazen of all her patients. The blonde just smiled and thanked the young woman for such a compliment. Syrinx thought that, because of how bad the blonde felt, he had become a little kinder. Heimdall was surprised when the protagonist suddenly grabbed him by the neck of his shirt and pulled him towards her. She told him she hoped the man wouldn't forget that she had helped him. Then Syrinx let him go and suggested he follow her, if that was what he wanted. However, she warned him that she wasn't planning to carry him if he suddenly fell. The protagonist turned around and with a mocking smile, called the blonde puppy. Heimdall laughed and told her that she was very generous of her. As soon as he asked where they were going, the girl replied that to the second district. But Syrinx wondered if they would manage to escape their pursuers by taking that path. The protagonist stopped dead when she saw 3 bandits right in front. In the fist of one of the men was a button representing the Dark Blessing Guild. The blonde also stopped and looked at the guys without the slightest interest. The bandits suddenly turned when they heard the noise and saw our protagonists. The protagonist cursed to herself because she didn't want them to be seen. The bandit captain ordered his men to eliminate them immediately. Syrinx took a precious stone from her pocket, perfectly understanding that they could have blocked all exits. She turned to her companion and asked if he could fight, but got no answer. The protagonist realized the situation was even worse, so she used her precious stone. As soon as she did, all the bandits rushed towards them at full speed. But the attackers stopped immediately when a bright light blinded them. Suddenly, Heimdall shot out and asked the girl to be more careful. With a single agile move, the blonde slit one of the bandits' throats. And in a matter of seconds, all 3 attackers lay dead on the ground. Heimdall warned the girl that if she didn't take responsibility for him, she would have serious problems. The protagonist stared at him and assured him with a serious voice that she had understood everything. The girl's obedience made a smile appear on the man's face. He expressed his hope that, from now on, she would try harder. Syrinx started thinking about how many precious stones she had left. That was the biggest drawback of her ability, because she could only use her power with stones. It was better not to waste spells on attacks, since now she couldn't let her guard down near the blonde. Looking around, Syrinx concluded that no one was following him anymore. She pointed her finger at the place where the second district was and informed her companion. The man noticed that the whole street here was illuminated by lanterns. But the protagonist warned him that, in these areas, there were also robberies and harassment. Even so, it was relatively safe here, so they could relax a little. Heimdall emphasized the word relatively, and the girl explained that compared to the first district, it was true. Suddenly, the protagonist heard heavy male breathing right behind her. She stopped dead and told the blonde that he was out of breath. Heimdall asked if she was really paying attention to that, and she replied that she was just observing. Syrinx felt responsible for the sick patient having difficulty walking next to her. Heimdall was genuinely happy that the girl noticed his breathing. And he asked if there was anything else about him that interested her. Although the protagonist had already healed his wound and fixed his broken arm, the man's body was still in shock. Syrinx huddled up and asked him why he was looking at her now, as if she were a pervert. She warned the blonde that if he didn't want to be tied up, he should behave calmly. Heimdall put his arm over her shoulder and told her she was very unpredictable. He asked if he could pay off his debt in installments, and Syrinx replied that there would be no installment payments. For now, the blonde could only thank her and nothing more. It wasn't easy for the protagonist at that moment, so she asked the man to look ahead. And not at her. After a while, they arrived at a huge mansion and stopped. Heimdall commented that the building wasn't bad at all, and the girl added that it was very much in the owner's style. At the door, a muscular man told the girl that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. The protagonist greeted him with a wave and replied that yes, it was true. They took our protagonists inside and then indicated which room they should enter now. Heimdall looked around and thought the atmosphere there was quite peculiar. The owner of the house said that from the beginning, guests had to be made to feel fear. The reason was that this person was a moneylender. Syrinx shook off her companion and immediately started stretching her shoulder. Then our protagonists were notified that they were already expected and could enter. Upon entering the room, our heroine supposed that the owner of the mansion already knew they were coming. The red-haired woman took a puff and invited them in. The feudal lord of the second district and moneylender was the second person the protagonist healed. Furthermore, that person was the richest in the area. The woman looked up and intently watched her savior. Syrinx bowed and said she was glad to see the Lord of Gold. Lintella Dulcines smiled and replied to the little one that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. The woman suggested getting straight to the point, because it was clear the guests hadn't come just to chat. Lintella reminded her guest that she was a woman of action. Putting down the pipe, she asked the protagonist what she was looking for her for. Then, the red-haired woman took another puff and exhaled the smoke. Lintella had a habit of not speaking until taking 2 puffs. People who reach the top in these kinds of businesses always have hard-to-understand quirks. Syrinx asked if she wasn't one of those people who could figure out these things easily. Lintella had her own information network, and many of her clients were informants. The woman wanted to know since, when the healer had such an interesting lover. The protagonist concluded that Heimdall had appealed to the moneylender. Lintella, just like the protagonist, had impeccable taste. But Syrinx placed her hand over the man's and cut off the woman's flow of thoughts. The blonde's eyes widened, and he stood still as soon as he felt the warmth of the girl's hands. The protagonist, smiling, informed the moneylender that she was keeping him for herself. Then, in a firm and confident voice, Syrinx added that he belonged to her. This made Heimdall look at the girl in surprise. Then, the blonde let out a slight smile upon understanding what was happening. The protagonist was surprised when the man suddenly lifted their intertwined hands. Heimdall told the red-haired woman that he had already sold himself. Syrinx smiled nervously and mentally congratulated the man for adapting so quickly. The protagonist threw a small pouch with a jewel onto the table, sure that the moneylender knew what it was about. But the woman pretended to think and asked her guest what that was. Syrinx, smiling, replied that she already knew everything. The protagonist took the antique in her hand, and, from the moneylender's reaction, she understood that, yes, she knew everything. She decided to tell her everything exactly as it was, since that object had been brought to the shop. Lintella asked the little one if she had really become someone's bait during this time. She clarified that it had nothing to do with her, as Syrinx might think. On the contrary, she was very curious to know who dared to touch someone protected by the feudal lord of the second district. That person is involved in murky things, and not just anyone can approach. But the protagonist saved him by accident. Lintella asked her guest what she wanted from her. The protagonist asked if by getting rid of that thing, she could be safe. The woman replied that it wasn't difficult, and asked the girl if she wasn't forgetting anything. For her, it was a minor issue, and Lintella could easily help the protagonist. But she would take it as a request. The protagonist smiled sideways and said that was the only thing she needed. Lintella promised to help the guest, but then her first request would be void. The red-haired woman smiled and asked if the girl agreed. At first, the protagonist just wanted to leave that place without a trace. Therefore, her priority was to find a special stone capable of granting that wish. She couldn't refuse that, so she told the lady she would do something for her. In return, Syrinx asked her to give her more stones like that one. Lintella wanted to know if the girl really intended to negotiate with her in such a situation. The protagonist reminded her of what she was capable of. She added that she didn't think it was difficult for a moneylender to get a black pearl and a black diamond. Lintella accepted and added that Syrinx was very good at what she did and didn't want to lose the one who had saved her. The protagonist applauded and suggested changing the topic a bit. Every month, the auction house brings loads of precious stones, and the most valuable is Princess Recidia's crown. It cost a fortune, and the winner was Hedorostempa, the woman's right-hand man. In other words, the winner was the feudal lord of the second district herself. But in reality, what the woman won at the auction was a good imitation. The woman reminded the girl that she should be aware of the importance of her words. The protagonist smiled mischievously and replied to Lintella that of course it was so. She proposed signing a contract on her hand, or if she wanted, on her head. Then Syrinx made a casual gesture and said she would give her life to the woman. Lintella looked at her servant standing by the door and ordered him to bring the scroll that proved the truth. The scroll's magic reveals if someone is lying. If they do, their heart breaks instantly along with the paper. After 7 years of use, the sale of that scroll was prohibited, but it was still possible to obtain one. The protagonist calmly repeated that it was fake and broke the scroll without flinching. She asked the woman if she remembered how the deal with the imperial merchant went. Syrinx had discovered all the forgeries, even those that Lintella's appraiser hadn't noticed. So she couldn't trust her. The girl said that in 3 months, they could sell them a response product at the auction. For Lintella, this not only meant losing assets, but also a blow to her pride. The intense red-haired woman asked the girl what she wanted this time. The protagonist smiled and replied that she needed a black pearl with a black diamond. Lintella asked her if she really intended to make a forgery. The young woman nodded without any remorse. Furthermore, Syrinx needed fake identities for both of them. Lintella told her it wasn't that hard, so she could do it for her. The protagonist explained that if her plan worked out, they could restore the moneylender's honor and take proper revenge. Hopefully, Syrinx could also get some rare stones. The woman liked the bravery and sincerity of her guest, so she hoped not to be disappointed. The young woman nodded, and a few seconds later, they brought the fake identification to the room. And the stones. Lintella announced that everything would be ready before the day after tomorrow's dawn. The protagonist got up from her seat and took the things they had brought. Syrinx looked at her companion and told him they could leave now. Just as the girl said, the moneylender should profit from what happened at the auction. However, the woman was curious to know what the girl would gain from all this. She asked her what she thought if she paid her that way. Lintella smiled and said that wasn't worth a shilling. She couldn't believe that her flowers for the visitor cost more than the precious stones. The protagonist replied that for her, what mattered was who that flower belonged to. But Syrinx expected that, after all this, the woman would grant that favor. Lintella asked the girl if she really intended to sell her that jewel, pointing at Heimdall. The young woman said she wasn't selling that precious stone because she had bought it for herself. Then the protagonist bowed and informed the lady that they were leaving. She was shocked when the blonde suddenly hugged her tightly by the waist from behind. Suddenly, in a seductive voice, the man replied that, unfortunately, he had already sold himself. For that very reason, he wasn't planning to sell himself to anyone else. Afterward, the muscular man led our 2 protagonists out of the huge mansion. He informed them that they had prepared a first aid kit for the guests, because one of them had been injured. The man extended his hand and added that, according to the owner, the girl should know where this place was. The protagonist took the key she had used last time and smiled at the guard. But there was no guarantee that in this place they could hide from their pursuers without being seen. Now that they had the highest level credential and the stone, the heroes had to do everything quickly. The protagonist looked at Heimdall and suggested they go at once. Then, the young woman took out a golden precious stone and activated it. Suddenly, the protagonist noticed that the footsteps behind her became silent. However, the girl wasn't worried, because she had someone capable of noticing if something went wrong. She wanted to talk about the place to the right, around the corner, but suddenly Heimdall shattered the golden crystal. The protagonist looked at the man stunned, just as he roughly grabbed her by the shoulder. Then, the blonde pushed the young woman against the wall and put a knife to her throat. Syrinx asked if it was fashionable now to pay people back for their kindness like this. Heimdall didn't answer anything, but a malicious smile appeared on his face.